Prior to 1994, most South African companies were isolated from the most progressive corporate governance initiatives across the world. This was mainly due to the economic sanctions imposed on South Africa as a result of the political situation. Now, a byproduct of South Africa's isolation was that, firstly, companies were largely isolated from international competition. And this was assisted and aided and reinforced by an extensive tariff structure that protected local companies from international competition. Secondly, there were extremely limited capital flows into South Africa and out of South Africa due to restrictive exchange controls. A third issue was that corporate governance structures in South Africa fell significantly behind international developments and international best practice. Now, this isolation, in effect, protected and cocooned many South African companies from international competition, from transparency regarding their corporate governance arrangements, and the effectiveness and the quality of the incumbent management teams. Management teams weren't put under as much scrutiny. And if you had to look at a lot of the South African listed companies, some very negative characteristics developed as a result of this. Firstly, they became bloated. They became quite bloated relative to their international counterparts. And that meant they were also significantly less efficient relative to their international counterparts. The management teams also were relatively complacent because they didn't have as many competitors, and frequently they dominated the market in South Africa. And then because companies grew within South Africa and started dominating specific markets, they ended up getting into other areas and establishing conglomerate structures because they couldn't expand internationally. So let me give an example. SAB started off by brewing beer, but they soon dominated the beer market. And what did? They moved into retail. They used to own Edgars or Edcon. They also used to own OK because they simply dominated the beer market, but they needed to expand their capital into other areas. There are also other conglomerate structures like Old Mutual. They started off as a life insurance or long-term insurance company, but they ended up in banking. They owned Nedbank, and they also owned Mutual and Federal, short-term insurance. Similarly, in the mining sector, Anglo. And all this happened because they couldn't expand internationally. But a lot of the time, it meant these companies lost their focus and their core expertise. They also set up pyramid structures, and really that was to entrench control. So we had a lot of companies issuing what were called N shares at the time, which entrenched management control and really violated and compromised minority shareholders. All this culminated in limited accountability to stakeholders and very, very complacent management teams. That's where we're coming from in terms of our historical background regarding corporate governance in South Africa particularly.